Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Write Right, a virtual program presented by the African American Research Library and Cultural Center and Broward County Library. My name is Stephen. I'm a librarian at the African American Research Library and Cultural Center. And what is this again? Well, this program, it's a digital program and it focuses on writing for preteens and teens and mostly creative writing, finding your voice and writing out of passion. So basically, it's not going to be the same as writing for school. It's just writing your stories and just some tips on how to do that. So, episode 1, we kind of focused more on authors and reading. This episode is going to be more about the process and the technical things. So, first, we're starting with writing prompts and story ideas. Okay, so the first slide we have here about writing prompts is actually a YouTube series from Jason Reynolds, which can be found on the Library of Congress YouTube channel. It's called Write, Write, Write. So kind of like the name of my series, except Jason Reynolds is much more successful and famous as a writer. He is actually the national ambassador for young people's literature, and he's written books including All American Boys, the Track series, and Long Way Down, among many others. So basically, I have up there a link to the first episode and a link to the playlist. But what his videos are is they're generally a minute and a half, 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes, and they focus on writing prompts. Now, a writing prompt is basically something that you can use, a question that you use to get an idea to what to write about. For instance, a writing prompt could be if you could have any kind of mythical or fictional animal as a pet, what would it be? So he has a bunch of different writing prompts like that. And some of them you might get a whole story out of, some of them you might not, but it's a good way to just think about different ideas. And he actually has a quote here on this slide. I don't really believe in correct. I just believe in doing it the way you do it. However you feel comfortable doing it, what feels real and true to you. And that's kind of what this series is about. It's writing with passion. It's finding that realness and that truth of what you want to write about. Okay, and next we have how to come up with story ideas and writing inspiration tips from Lily Mead. Lily Mead is a freelance writer. She's had her work published in Teen Vogue and Bustle, among other places. And she's also an aspiring young adult fantasy writer. So she hasn't had any of her books published yet, but she's working with an agent on getting those published. And her YouTube channel has a lot of different writing tips, videos of writing tips on it. So I'm going to be going back to her a couple times. But the first one that she has up there is the first tip she has is inspiration isn't something you wait for, it's something you seek. So basically, that's just saying that you don't need to necessarily wait around to get inspired. You can actually make it happen. So, one of the things she actually mentions is that reading can teach you sort of the proper sentence structure and things like that, but it can be more used for inspiration. So, you can always get inspired by something you read about a different perspective, or just even characters from a book inspiring the way you feel about characters. So there's a lot of different ways to find that inspiration. The second tip she has is listening to music, and she mentions particularly mood playlists. So basically, finding a playlist based on sort of the theme of what you're trying to write, or that is relates to a character you're writing about, or maybe a villain, or maybe just the setting of your story. So it can be music with lyrics or even instrumental music, but she's often inspired by music. And a lot of writers will have or include playlists as well on their websites because they'll have that kind of level of inspiration from music. Something else that she mentions is a novel aesthetics or a mood board. Now, basically, a mood board is kind of like a vision board, but for your story. So you could use a collage or different pictures to kind of inspire your characters or your setting. So that's just something you can do. Um, Something else, and this is more if you're writing something longer, but to have a centralized place for ideas, to have like a notebook where you can jot down every little thought you have about the direction of your story. Because sometimes it might not be something that you can use in the first paragraph or first couple pages, but it's something you might want to pick up on later. And so it's nice to just have that written down. And last but not least, she mentions talking over things with a friend. So it could be a friend, could be a family member. And it depends how comfortable you are showing other people you're writing. But sometimes you'll be stuck and you'll be reading the same paragraph or two over and over again and not know how to fix it. And a fresh perspective can really help with that. Okay, and moving on to the writing process. Now, this one's a little trickier because every writer's writing process looks a little bit different. And the same can be said for everything that I'm discussing, but particularly writing process, writers have a different way of doing things. But I found a pretty interesting video with Saba Tahir and Tomi Adeyemi, who are both successful fantasy writers. Tomi Adeyemi wrote Children of Blood and Bone, and Saba Tahir wrote the Ember and Ashes series. And basically, this was them interviewing each other about their writing process. So they found some things in common. They're both successful fantasy writers, but they're also both children of immigrants. Saba Tahir is Pakistani American. Her parents came from Pakistan. Tomi Adeyemi, her parents emigrated from Nigeria. So they kind of found that in common too, even though their parents came from different places. They kind of had similar experiences growing up. And basically, there were a couple interesting quotes there about their process. So Tomi Adeyemi said, "I see the alternate story. I have like fan fiction of what I wish could happen because you get to the point where you're like, I could do this, but I know this is the better story." And Saba Tahir said something similar. She said, "I knew it was going to be really hard to write, and a big part of that is sometimes characters do things, and you're like, don't do it, don't do it. Oh, you're doing it." So basically, what they're talking about is how sometimes your plot or your characters can kind of have a mind of its own or a mind of their own, and they can just go in a direction you don't expect. But as part of the process, you can kind of roll with that and see where it leads. And a lot of times it'll lead to a better story than you originally envisioned. So that was, I think, an interesting thing about their process. All right. And moving on, developing plots and world building. This is going to be a few slides because this is a pretty significant part of writing a story. So again, we've got Lily Mead up there. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, I'm trying to focus on letting writers of color kind of tell their own stories about the writing process and about what they do. And she, as I mentioned, has a lot of good YouTube videos about her process and about ways to do it. So basically, she starts off with a quote about what world building actually is. So, world building is the process behind developing all the nitty gritty details of the setting or society your characters live in. It can be the type of food your characters eat, to the religion they practice, to the type of magic they use, to the language they speak, and so on and so on. So, basically, world building is really important if you're writing a science fiction or fantasy story. But it's also important if you're writing something realistic that relates to your neighborhood or your community, and just kind of letting people who read see that and finding a way to just explain it to them. And even if you're writing for yourself, that you don't want anyone to see it, that's even important for you to be able to look back on and remember. So I think world building is important in that way too. And another thing she mentions is, here's the guiding rule behind smart world building: story comes first. You need to have a good balance of all three: character, plot, and world if you want a good story. Your world should be an extension of the ideas you intend to share. It depends on what you want to focus on. So basically, all of those are important. So you can't just build the world and then not focus on the characters or the plot, but they kind of all work together. So it's important. All right, so continuing on with world building, something that she mentions is that details are a lot more believable and easy to remember when they're said through dialogue or action instead of pages upon pages of exposition. So basically, that's the idea. Your teachers have probably told you this too, to show and not tell. So basically, if characters are talking to each other about a plot point or action is happening, people are going to be able to focus a lot more on your story. And even for you, it's going to be a little easier to write rather than just doing the dry exposition there. And she also mentions conflict and the importance of that. So she said, conflict is a great way to connect your world to your story. Conflict is essential to good story. Plot is defined by conflict. Your characters need internal conflict. So basically, every story that you're going to read, there's going to be something that happens to guide the story. There's going to be something that goes wrong, even if it's in the main character's, just in the main character's head. You're going to see that in stories. So there's always going to be some sort of conflict. And this also relates to world building, but it's only one part of it. She says, she talks about setting. So your setting is more important than you think. Your plot, your characters, neither will work if readers can't connect with the world they live in. Focus on what excites you. Your world, like all your writing, will shine brightest when you're happy to share it. So that means whenever you're building a world, particularly if you're doing fantasy or science fiction, focus on the details that you're excited about. For instance, if you create a fantasy world where there is a sport that doesn't exist on our world, and you're really excited about that sport and the competition or the rules of it and things like that, people reading it are going to notice that and notice, oh, you're really into that. Or even if you're writing for yourself, like write something that excites you. But for instance, if you're not into sports at all and you just kind of go through a boring, long explanation of it because you think someone else will want to read that, people will notice that too. And they'll say, okay, this is starting to drag. What's going on here? Okay, and developing characters. So this also this is one part of putting everything together, but characters are really important because sometimes you have a setting or you have a plot that just doesn't excite you very much. But if you've got really good, really interesting characters, sometimes readers can overlook that. Or sometimes you can just rewrite the plot around those characters. So what I have here on this slide is a video with a video featuring Jacqueline Woodson. Jacqueline Woodson is a very successful author who's been doing it for a long time. Some of the books she's written are After Tupac and Dee Foster and Peace, Love, Locomotion. So she has a process and she has a lot of ideas about how to write, and that she's found are successful. And I think she had some interesting things to say about developing characters in this video. So she said, a good story has to have good characters that the reader cares about. I think about my characters for a long time, or they're somewhere in my head, and I think about what they're doing, what choices they're making, who they're becoming, and a lot of that does happen before I sit down to start writing them. And once in a while, I'll jot down notes and time periods, maybe even physical stuff about that time period. What was the fashion? What was the music of that time? What did they have if they were coming from a poor or working class community? So basically, she focused on developing the characters and building the world they were in at the same time. because a lot of times with the characters, where they live or who they're around defines that character. So, basically, as I mentioned in the last episode, and I wanted to bring up again, we are currently, as we're recording this, we are physically closed. However, we've got a lot of electronic resources that you can access through our website or through our brand new app, Communico. Communico you can get through Android and the Google Play Store if you've got an Android phone. And then our website is browardlibrary.org. And you can find all kinds of electronic resources, ebooks, audiobooks. You can stream movies, TV shows, music. You can get live online tutoring. You can do different research. There's just a lot of things that are available, even though we're not currently open to the public. All right. And thank you again for watching. Our next episode is going to be about writing poetry. And as always, write out of passion.